Neil deGrasse Tyson says that the theory of evolution, like the theory of gravity, is a scientific fact. The leading philosopher, but science Dr. Karl Popper, said that evolution is not a fact, doesn't even qualify as a theory or a hypothesis. It's a metaphysical research program and not really testable science. Stephen Hawking said, before we understood science, it was natural to believe that God created the universe, but now science offers a more convincing explanation. Richard Dawkins said that if evolution is just a theory, well, so is gravity, and I don't see you jumping out of buildings. However, Dennis Noble, an experimental physiologist, said that all the central assumptions of the modern synthesis, often also called neo-Darwinism, have been disproved. Carl Sagan said that evolution is a fact, not a theory. Sir Arthur Keith wrote the foreword to the 100th anniversary edition of Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, and he said, "Evolution is unproved and unprovable. We believe it only because the only alternative is special creation, and that is unthinkable." This article reports that animals keep inexplicably evolving into crabs. Could humans be next? The research on crab evolution was done by Joanna Wolf with a PhD in biology from Okinawa, Japan. She says that the most recent common ancestor of humans and true crabs was likely a worm-like animal called a Biolatatirian that lived hundreds of millions of years ago.
The theory of evolution is not a scientific theory. It is a religion, and it was used to justify racism and the eugenics movement by Adolf Hitler and others for the goal of exterminating inferior races for the progression of superior genes in the evolution of humans.
Bible says that God created everything that is in heaven and earth in 6 literal 24-hour periods of time and rested on the 7th day, and that was less than 7,000 years ago. But according to these scientists, we all evolved from a worm.
Evolution theory teaches that humans evolved from worms. We hear ancient ancestor or worm because that's what evolution teaches, even though there's no experimental evidence to show that a worm can evolve into something that walks around on.
It's completely unscientific and based on science fiction. Star Trek and Star Wars are the basis for this humanistic religion that has control over the school systems, and that's the only reason that evolution is surviving is by tax dollars alone, and that makes atheism the only religion in the United States that is tax supported.
Matthew Wills, who has a PhD in evolutionary paleobiology at the University of Bath in England, said that it's difficult to make a change in one place without deleterious effects in another. Says with very few exceptions, we're stuck with the number of vertebrae that we have. What he's saying is that the genetic code is programmed to perform specific functions, and if you make changes to that code, it creates deleterious information. So what he's saying is that it would totally destroy the DNA. The more changes that you make, the more destruction you create in the genetic information. And so things generally stay the same with very few exceptions. And the only way that you can get a major change without destroying the DNA is to have millions of years. The article says that a mammal and a squid evolved eyes independently from a single common ancestor, which the article says was a worm. The human eye has hundreds of thousands of connections just within a single square inch of the eyeball, and there are millions of these connections. There is no way that the complexity of the eye could have evolved. In fact, if you look at the earliest life forms that there are in the geologic column at the bottom of the layers of strata, where the earliest fossils of life forms are, the trilobite fossils have, according to experts in biology, the most complex eyes ever produced by nature. And so if you have the earliest life forms having the most complex eyes that there is in all of the life forms.
Trilobites are the earliest life forms that there are, other than the single cells that are even lower than them. But in between the single cells and the fully formed, fully developed, and complex body plans appear suddenly with no intermediate fossils linking them to the single-celled remnants that are beneath. And so what you have is no evidence in the fossil record of eyes evolving, and especially in the laboratory, there is no experiment ever to take something that doesn't have eyes and through artificial breeding experiments produce an eye, even the simplest eye structure.
The article says that humans are still evolving. In one case, modern descendants of people who settled in the high Tibetan plateau more than 10,000 years ago can do what most can't: live in higher elevations and experience no hypoxia, which is oxygen starvation in the body's tissues, and that's because they develop traits that help their blood deliver oxygen more efficiently. So they say that given enough time, humans can and do evolve, just not into crabs. Notice, given enough time, they can evolve, just not into crabs.
So their logic is that we can evolve from a worm over billions of years, and we can evolve eyes from something that didn't have eyes, but we can't evolve into a crab. The reason that they provide that we can't evolve into crabs is because it would require too many major changes. But the same major changes are going to have to be overcome if you evolve a worm into a human or a crab. The more changes that you make, and the more drastic those changes are, the more harmful effects are going to be. But given enough time, we can evolve from primitive life forms. There's no way that you can get a worm to evolve into something that walks around unless you have a super high-powered magical ingredient called millions of years. This is the only way that you get a worm to evolve into a land-dwelling creature.
Or the teaching of common ancestry suggesting that we all evolved from a primitive life form called a worm 3 billion years ago should be discarded as a scientific theory and considered a religion.